What's going on, everybody? Daniel LeMay here. Welcome back to Doing It with AI, and today we're going to be talking about Python, Power Automate, ChatGPT, HTML. I'm just throwing all the acronyms at you today, but this is really cool, so stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this. Alright, so as you know, this channel is all about how can we integrate AI in our daily workflows, how can we make life easier for ourselves by letting the machines do a lot of the work. And this is a perfect real-world example that I'm about to show you. So a while back, I needed to prove out a concept. I needed to be able to create a calendar entry based on some data that was coming from an external API, and I wanted to use a Cloudflow to do this in Power Automate. And I had a webhook that was going to be sending a payload over to my Power Automate Cloudflow. I had an HTTP request received trigger, and I needed to parse that JSON, get some dates out of it, and then create some calendar entries in exchange. And that all seems pretty straightforward until you take into consideration time zones. Anybody who's built anything with time or time zones knows it can be a real pain. And the data that was coming out of the payload from the webhook did not match up with the out-of-the-box actions for Power Automate to create some calendar entries. So I needed to figure out how to transform the string that was coming out of the payload to make it match what was coming out of the action in Power Automate. So instead of trying to figure out a way to do this with string manipulation and flow expressions, I decided to throw this problem at ChatGPT and see if it could do it for me. And the solution that it came up with was pretty amazing. Let's dive in and take a look. So I feel like the best way to kind of explain to you how I went through the thought process of building this solution and using ChatGPT to kind of help me figure out a problem is to relive that experience with you and go ahead and build the flow from scratch. We'll integrate with Postman to make some calls. We'll use VS Code to kind of manipulate some information. And then you'll really understand exactly what I went through to figure this out. So I've started a new flow here, and I'm going to search for a trigger. I know what I want. It's the HTTP request trigger. There it is when an HTTP request is received. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that. Now, I can't show you the actual request body JSON schema. This was a proof of concept for a client of Power Apps 911, and there was some sensitive information in there, and so I'm going to have to generate my own sample payload to define the schema for this trigger. So I'm going to make it an array, and I'm going to put a record in here, and I'm going to have a key value pair where the key is called time, and it's going to produce a date string. But in our case, I don't want to type out a whole date string, so I'm just going to write the word string, which is going to have the same effect. So I'll hit done, and you can see there it's the type of array, and inside there we have some items with the properties of time, and time is a string data type. So that's going to work for us. We're going to go ahead and create a new step. One of the things I like to do when I'm building out flows, especially if I'm trying to pull some data out of JSON that's coming into the flow, is to put a compose action right after the trigger. And that will allow me to kind of drill into the data to find the specific key value pair or array or object or whatever it is I'm trying to get, and just bring it into the compose to kind of silo it away from the rest of the noise, and I can figure out exactly what I want. So because I've defined this request body schema as an array, I can't use this time dynamic content. Now, we know that time is the value that we want to get out, but we can't use this because if I click this, I'm going to go ahead and do it and show you what happens, right? If I click it, it creates an apply to each. Why does it do that? Because it's an array. So Flow is trying to be helpful. It's saying, oh, I know that the request body is producing an array, and you want the time value. Well, there's going to be multiple time values potentially, so I'm going to go ahead and try and apply this action to each of those. We don't need that. We don't need to do that. So what I'm going to do is kind of get that time dynamic content out of there, drag this compose out, and go ahead and get rid of the apply to each. And instead here, I'm going to create my own expression. So I'm going to take the body. So this is going to give us that array of time values. And I'm going to copy this, throw it over in the expression section here, and I'm going to drill down into it, but I know there's only ever going to be one record because I'm going to be the one sending the payload, and so I'm going to only ever send one record. So I'm going to drill into that first record by putting a question mark and then a 0 inside these square brackets, which lets me say I specifically want the first item in that array. And I'll put another question mark, and then I'm going to say I want the time value out of that. So we'll hit OK, and now we have our compose action. So now I'm going to go ahead and click save. And of course, this doesn't really do anything except extract that value that I want so that I can validate that that's actually what I'm wanting to work with. And if we go back to our trigger, we can see we actually have a post URL now, which is going to be super helpful because we're about to switch over to Postman so that we can copy this URL, which I'll just click this little button to do. And we're going to make a post to that URL from Postman and see what happens. So let's go over to Postman and take a look. Alright, so here we are on Postman. Now, if you don't know about Postman, there's a bunch of great YouTube videos about how to use Postman. I'm not going to go into that in this video. It's a really robust app for testing APIs, making API calls, creating collections, where you can, have a whole bunch of different methods and different endpoints defined for a single, web service. Again, huge topic. I'm not going to go into it right now. So what I am going to do, though, is just use it to do a quick post to that URL that we copied earlier in the video. So I'm going to create a new request, and I can do that by just coming up here to this plus sign, and then it creates a new untitled request, as you can see there. So I'm going to say I want to do a post. I'm going to put in that URL that I copied from our trigger in Power Automate. So you can see it pulls some parameters out of here. That's fine. It's reading those from the URL itself. We're going to leave that alone. And then I'm going to go over here to the body section, and I'm going to do raw. And the raw body that I want to put in is the same as the sample payload, except this time I'm not going to just put in string, right? Time is equal to string. I'm going to put in time, and then I'm going to put in an actual string value, which is the date string that I want to use for the rest of this demo. So that string is shaped like this: year, month, day, time, and then time zone. So in this case, it's plus 11 UTC. So that's the string I'm going to pass in. We've got it set to raw here. Let's try it out. I'm going to hit send. Okay. It said 202 accepted is the status. So the request has been accepted for processing. Let's jump back over to the flow and see if it actually worked. So here we are on the flow again. And, I've done this a few times. I have a suspicion that my compose action may not produce the result that I want. And so what I think I'm going to do is throw in one of my favorite actions of all time in Power Automate, and that's called parse JSON. And what I'm going to do is, for the content parameter for parse JSON, I'm going to tell it I want to use the body. So I'm going to use the trigger body that comes out. That's our payload from when the request is received. And then for the schema, well, we know what the schema looks like. It actually looks just like this. So I'm going to copy the schema from the trigger and paste it in here. Then down here in the compose, instead of using the trigger body, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and look, if you notice, time is now available in the parse JSON action. I'm going to use the body from parse JSON. I'm going to copy that and use that for my expression. Why am I doing this? Just experience. I've done this a few times, and it just seems to be more consistent. What I like to do is I like to use more actions than I need initially when I'm building my flows, and then I kind of shrink those down to the minimum actions required and make the flow as efficient as possible later once I have everything working the way I want. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pick that first array element, and we're going to pick the time value out of it. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit save. And then what I'm going to do is go to test, and I'm going to hit manually. And I'm going to hit test. So let's really quick switch back over to Postman. And then let's go ahead and hit send again. All right, it's sent. Let's go back to Power Automate, and let's see what happens. Okay, it was successful. So it worked. We were able to parse that JSON from the trigger. You can see there's our time value, the string that we put in, and there is the actual date time value that we got out. So now that that's done, and we know that we can send a payload to the flow, let's go ahead and keep building this flow out a little bit. I'm going to edit the flow. I'm going to add a new step. And the action that I needed to use was to create an event in Outlook in Exchange. So if I add an operation here, I can pick the create event v4 action. I'm just going to play around with this. I'm going to add it to my own calendar. I've got access to a few people's calendars here, but I'm going to add it to my own. The subject is going to be ChatGPT rocks. And then the start time, we want to use, let's see, we want to use everything except that UTC value. See, it shows us that there's an example right there. There's an example of the kind of time that it wants to bring in. So we could just go in and say, yeah, we want to do, the time value from parse JSON. And again, it's wanting to, since I picked that time value, it's wanting to create and apply to each, but we don't want that. I'm going to get rid of that. Bring it up here. Get rid of the apply to each. What I actually want is the outputs of the compose. And then let's say I want the end time to be like 30 minutes later, right? So what I'm going to do is write an expression for that. So I'm going to put the end time in there. That gives me, again, the outputs of my compose, which, if you remember, is the time value that we sent in from our payload. And I'm going to go ahead and copy the end time and write a quick expression. And with date and time, I know I just want to add 30 minutes to that start time. So I'm going to come down and see my add minutes here. I'm going to pick add minutes. I'm going to paste in the outputs of my compose, which is the same as the start time in this case. And I'm going to put a comma. And then I want to say I want to add 30 minutes. And hit OK. So that should add 30 minutes to my start time. Now, here's where we get to the interesting part, the time zone. So we know that the end of our datetime string has this +11:00 on it. Well, that is the actual time zone that it wants. But just because it has that on there doesn't mean that the start time and end time are going to respect that time zone. And in fact, what we have here is a time zone parameter that has to be set. It's a required field for this particular action. So let's just take a look at what's available. We've got a long list of things that are available here. There's a lot of duplicates in here, and it's just the list it's not available online. I went to Google. I tried to type in create event v4, give me a list of all the time zones. I couldn't find what I needed. So what I did was I knew it was +11, so I came down and I looked for UTC +11. And I found all these different options. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, what is there? 6 different +11s. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter whether it's Magadan or Norfolk Island. They're both +11. I don't know what the difference is. We're not going to go through that in this video. So I just chose Magadan, right? But here's the thing. This is a global company I was doing this POC for. So it's possible that +11 is not always the time zone that's going to be used. So how are we going to handle that? Well, there's a really interesting thing we can do here. So let's go up above our create event and let's do a little bit of manipulation of this. Now we know that our time string is shaped like this: year, month, day, time, and time zone. So we can do some string manipulation against this to just split this piece off. I was going to add another compose action. I think I will do that actually. Let's add another compose action. And let's take the outputs of our previous compose. And what I want to do is I want to split that time zone piece off of the time itself, the date and time itself. So what I'm going to do is say split. I'm going to put in the outputs of my compose. So again, the date time string that comes from our payload. And this time I want to split on the plus sign. Okay, now what that's going to do is create an array. And if there were multiple plus signs in that string, then we would have more than 2 records in our array. But there's only 1 plus sign in that string. So we're going to have 2 records in the output of this split. And I know that I want the last one. Why do I know that? Because when you split that string in half, the first part is going to be the date and the time. The second part is going to be the time zone. So I'm going to say last split outputs compose, and we're going to split on that plus sign. And that's going to be my, oh, I missed a parenthesis there, but that's going to be my expression. So before we come in and create our event now, let's just add a terminate in here, because we want to check and see, did what we just do actually work? Did that split work the way that we think it was going to? Terminate allows us to kind of stop the flow in its tracks, and anything below that terminate action is not going to run. So I like to use this a lot to kind of stop flows, do some checking, and then continue on. Let's run a quick test. Okay, time zones required. Let's just go set any old thing. I don't know, -11, doesn't matter. It's not going to run anyway, flow. Why are you bothering me with that? Okay, so we're going to run a test here. All right, we ran successfully. Let's see what compose 2 looks like. All right, interesting. So it looks like this. We have 11. So in our case, we split on the plus sign. Now, what are some other ways we can consider doing that? Well, we could count the number of characters and split after a certain number of characters. That would work. There's probably a handful of ways that we could handle that. So let's take a look at one of the other ways. Because, you know, 11 is great, but there's the potential there that maybe it's -11, which is what we had set for the create event action down here, which is coordinated universal time, -11. That's not the same as +11. In fact, it's the opposite. So let's see what some other options are. So we've got this compose action, right? And what we did originally was we said we wanted to split on the plus sign. Well, that would, that would work sort of, but it doesn't give us the +11 that we need. It just gave us 11. So let's see what else is available. If we look at our expressions, when you look down through here, in here somewhere, there's going to be something called slice. I believe it's in the string functions. There it is. Slice returns a section of a string defined by the start index, and if you want, an ending index. Well, what does that mean? It means the number of characters from the beginning of the string to whatever we want before we want to start slicing the thing up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type this back out again. We know it was year, month, day, time, 8 a.m., 8:30, plus 11. So what I'm going to do now is just look at this for a second. I believe that's 19 characters. So what slice is going to let us do is it's going to let us say, hey, after the 19th character, I want whatever's left, because we're not going to define an ending index. So for this expression, go ahead and delete this. For this last expression, I'm actually going to switch that to be not splice, but slice. I'm going to get rid of my split, and then I'm going to come over here where my plus sign is, get rid of that last parenthesis, and I'm going to put in 19. Double check your spelling, people. I can't spell half the time. So puts is definitely not going to work. Let's go with outputs. All right, slice outputs, compose, comma 19. Update, and then let's get rid of our first one here. Let's go ahead and run a test on that. Let's see if that worked. Okay, it ran successfully. And there we go. Now our compose is showing what we want, +11. Okay, so that works pretty well, right? So from this point, what's next? What are we going to do from here? Well, what we need to be able to do is define a custom value for this time zone parameter. And if you scroll down to the very, very bottom, it'll say enter custom value. And that will allow you to type in a custom value. But the problem, and what I've discovered, is that the custom value actually has to match up to be one of these values from this list. And like I said before, this list is not available. At least I couldn't find it. Maybe it's available somewhere. If it is, leave me a comment down below. Let everybody know, because it would make life a lot easier. But what I did instead was I said, well, how am I going to solve this? What I need to be able to do, let me go ahead and delete this terminate. What I need to be able to do is say, based on what the output of this compose number 2 here is, this slice expression that we just wrote, I need to be able to set a custom value for the time zone. But I don't want to have to write all of these things down and then write a crazy expression which would look through those things and figure out, what does plus 11 equal? And it could be any of these that are down here. If we scroll down again down to plus 11, it could be any of these. I don't really care as long as one of them is selected. So how would we do that? Well, I started thinking about it and I thought the best way to do that would be to create another compose action or maybe a variable and create an array and have an array of all of these options and then filter that array based on the output of compose number 2, the output of this slice that we just did. And what that would let us do is say, if one of these values here contains plus 11, then just give me the first one. I don't care, right? Bougainville, I probably butchered that, sorry. Bougainville Island. I don't care what it is as long as it's plus 11, right? The problem is, this is a really, really long list. So, how did I solve it? Well, this is where ChatGPT comes in. So, I started thinking about it, and I said, I bet that this is in the HTML of this web page somewhere. So, could I extract this table of data to very quickly create a new array that I could then filter based on that plus 11 value? Well, turns out I can. And so let's take a second and walk through. It's going to be more than a second, let's be honest. Let's take a few minutes and walk through how I did that. So if you're using Chrome like I am, you have access to something called developer tools. And I know this exists in Firefox. It probably exists in Opera. I know it exists in Edge since it's a Chromium-based browser, just like Chrome is. What the developer tools does is it gives you access to a whole bunch of information about what's going on behind the scenes in your browser. So this would be information like the code itself that's being run to show you these websites that you're looking at, network traffic and information, performance, right? How much RAM is being consumed, all those sorts of things. All that information is available in developer tools. And a lot of it's not going to really be useful unless you're like, a developer and you're actually building websites, you're a pro code developer. That's not me, but what I use it for is to see network traffic and code. And so what I did here is I said, I bet I could use developer tools to look inside this list and actually get the HTML that's behind the scenes that enumerates this list and then pull that into something like VS Code, a code editor, and maybe do some manipulation with it. Maybe I can create my array out of that. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do real quick. So you can either go up here to this ellipsis in the top right hand corner, hit that, and then go to more tools and developer tools, which isn't showing up when I try to record it. Or you can do what I like, which is shortcut keys, and do Control-Shift-I, which is going to open up the developer tools for you. So what you want to do is you want to be on this Elements tab. And Elements is going to show you the actual code that's happening on the page that you're currently looking at. And it's kind of interesting, right? You can expand these different elements and look into them. And as you kind of move across the code, it starts highlighting stuff on the screen. But because modern websites are so complex, this isn't going to give you a whole bunch of information right off the bat, right? So what you want to do is go up here to this little icon that has a kind of like a cursor and a square, and it's an element selector. So if you click that, what happens then is that as you hover over things on the website that you're looking at, you're going to see those things reflected in the elements window to the right. So you're going to be able to start seeing the code behind the scenes. That's really useful. That's exactly what we want. So if we come down here to our Create Event V4 action, and we hover over our drop down here, we can start to see some things. So over on the right, we look. I'm going to go ahead and click on this. And what happens is it kind of sticks on one thing. So this is a div element. This doesn't really tell me anything. In fact, it's a little bit obfuscated. I can't really see what's going on over there. I certainly know that the list of things that I want to get out of there, the time zones, isn't there. So I'm just going to go ahead and expand this out because I have a feeling that down in here somewhere is going to be the information that I want. So nested inside that div is a span. I'm going to expand that out. Yeah, I still don't see what I want. So where could this be? Well, I'm going to start just kind of looking down through these things. So I've got a bunch of divs down here, and notice that as I'm kind of moving down on the right hand side, I'm still hovering over the time zone dropdown. So as I go through all of this, we're still inside that parent div that's controlling that dropdown. And what I like to do is look at the names of these controls, and it gives you some context. If it's a well-coded website, it gives you some context as to what you're looking at. I mean, this is a combo box, right? That's good. That's good to know. So maybe I need to expand this time zone dropdown. Let me hit that. Does that change anything? It does. Look, some new div class appeared over here. And in fact, it has an ARIA label. So, a label with the ARIA font called time zone. Interesting. So let's expand that out a little bit. Okay, now we have another div class, MSLA, combo box options, enums. Okay, enumeration. That seems like that could be the ticket. So let's expand that out a little further because I still don't see a list in there. I do see enter custom value, but I don't see a list of all the time zones like I'm seeing in the dropdown. So let's expand that out. Okay, now we have an OL class. Still no list. Expand that out. And okay, now we're starting to see some stuff that looks really good. So if we look in here, as we hover over these things, notice on the left there in the dropdown how it's hovering over the different options in the dropdown. And in fact, if you look inside of each of these AID elements, you're going to see the ARIA label is equal to the string that we actually want to extract. So this is really useful. So okay, we know that this particular OL element has what we need. How do we get this out of there? Well, what's really cool about developer tools is for any of these elements that you're inspecting, you can right click on them and hit edit as HTML. So you can't see this on your screen, but what I'm doing here is right clicking and I get a list of things here. And one of them is edit as HTML. So I'm going to click that. And what it does is it brings up all of that OL class information that I was just looking at in HTML in this scroll box. So then I can pull this out, which is really cool. And if I can get that HTML out, then there's a good chance I can do some modification, some string manipulation against it, right? So I am going to just click in here somewhere, do a Control A and a Control C, and then what I like to do here is go over to a text editor. Now you could use Notepad++, you could use Visual Studio. I really like VS Code because it's free and it handles basically every programming language I've ever heard of. So that's what I'm going to switch to. And what I'm going to do is take what I just copied and throw it over into VS Code, and it will format this for us so that we can get a better look at what we're dealing with here, and then we'll take it another step further. So let's pop over to VS Code real quick. All right, so here we are in VS Code. If you're not familiar with VS Code, just like with Postman, there's a million YouTube videos. Go check one out. VS Code is awesome. I've been trying to convince my colleagues to use VS Code for a really long time. It's just a great text editing tool. It can do comparisons. It has a bunch of extensions into common services that you probably already use. And if you're a developer, then it's just a great alternative to paying for a Visual Studio license if you don't have one. Anyway, I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to do a new text file. Notice it says select the language. I know what I'm about to put in. It's HTML. But there is also this option to auto-detect. So I could put HTML in here. Down here in the right-hand corner, it tells us what our language mode is. My guess is that it's going to understand it's HTML. So I'm just going to paste it in and see what happens. Notice, HTML. It figured it out. So if it understands what language it's dealing with, then a lot of times it can actually format the text that you paste in. Because if you notice, we've just got this massive string here all on one line. And it's even less readable than it was over there in Chrome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and hit Format Document. And boom, it formats it for us. So this makes it a little bit more readable. And even more exciting than that, if we look in here, we start to see all of these values that we were looking to pull out in the first place. When I was figuring this out myself, I made it to this point and I went, okay, so what can I do here? I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I did know that Python and other scripting languages are really, really good at extracting values from giant strings. And so what I did was I took a look at what these things were, where they lived. And it turns out that they all live inside of span elements. So if we look at this one, UTC+2, which is Jerusalem, we can see that it lives inside of some span tags, okay? And I got to looking at the code a little bit more, and I realized that basically the only span tags in this entire OL class element or object is populated with one of these UTC values that I was trying to extract. And so I thought to myself, what I should do is just go over to ChatGPT and see if it can write me a script of some kind that could extract these values from the span tags without me having to figure out a way to do it myself. So let's take a look at how that worked. Let's switch over to ChatGPT. Okay, here we are at ChatGPT. So what I did at this point was I decided I'm just going to ask ChatGPT to do the thing that I would have to figure out how to do myself. So what I did was I said, okay, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Well, the problem I'm trying to solve is I need to extract values from span tags in that big OL class element that we had pulled out of the Power Automate webpage. And so what I did was I went over to ChatGPT and I just gave it a really specific set of instructions. So I said something like, show me only the values that appear in span tags from the HTML held in a variable called code, and represent those values in a JSON array as records with the following shape. And then I defined a shape, and I said TZ, which is time zone, of course. And then I gave it this value, which was called span value, which I didn't know if it would understand that or not, but that's what I gave it. And then I just hit enter. And so here it goes, right? Here's the power of ChatGPT in action. So it's going to import a module, or a library, in this case probably, called Beautiful Soup. And then it says, okay, soup equals beautiful soup, code, html.parser, soup.findAll, span values, tz span.text for span in span. So this is a loop, a for all loop right here. And then JSON data equals json.dumps span values. And then print that out. Interesting. So what do you do with this at this point? Well, you pop back over to VS Code and you see if it works. So I'm going to hit copy code, and I'm going to switch back over to VS Code. So here I am back on VS Code, and I've got my HTML that's still showing up here, but I need to create a new file that's going to hold my Python script that ChatGPT just wrote for me. So I'm going to hit new text file, and just like last time, you know what? I'm going to let it see if it can figure out what language I'm using, just out of curiosity. So I'm going to paste in. Well, that's not what I want, is it? I had thought that I'd copied that. There it is. So I'm going to paste that in, and it didn't pick it up, but it's probably because I pasted HTML in there first. So I'm going to come down here and select my language mode and go and find Python. I could type it in up here too, Python. And now what I have is I have my code, but I need to make some modifications to it. So this is a really important thing to understand about ChatGPT. It's not going to do everything for you. It's not going to do your job for you. It's not going to write every single script for you in its entirety. Most likely you're going to have to make some modifications. And in my case, I told ChatGPT that I wanted to have a variable which held my HTML code for it to process, and I wanted that variable to be called code. So what I'm going to do is edit my script. I'm going to come in and I'm going to define another variable here called code. And by the way, if I didn't know how to do this, like if I didn't know how to define a variable in Python, then I would just go back to ChatGPT and say, how do I define a variable in Python? and it would explain that to me. And here's another really good example, right? So code, I know it should be the HTML from my other file over here, this one, right? So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to paste it in. And this isn't going to work because we have some red lines in here. IntelliSense is seeing all of these issues. You can see this big red bar along the side. It's not going to work because code should be a string. And in Python, when you want to define a string in a variable like this, you need to wrap it in 3 double quotes. Again, I know that because I've done this before, but the last time that I did this, I didn't know that, and so I had to go to ChatGPT and ask it, how do I define a string variable in Python? And it told me that I need to wrap all of the string that I want to set in the variable in triple double quotes. So I'm going to do that. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to come down here to the bottom of this big HTML block right there and do 1, 2, 3. All right. And so now everything looks happy. IntelliSense is happy. The red bar is gone from the side. So now what I'm going to do is go up here to run, and I'm going to hit run without debugging. And what it's going to do is it's going to pop up and make me save the file. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. You can't see that on your screen, but it's there's nothing to it. You just give the file a name and hit save. So I'm going to call it importjson.py, which is a Python file. Okay, so it's telling me no module named BS4. Okay. So how would we handle this problem? Well, we can hover over BS4 up here and see what it says. It says, could not be resolved from the source, report missing module source. Okay, fair enough. Why don't we switch back over to ChatGPT and see what it says? All right, we're back on ChatGPT. So let's just ask it, how do I import the BS4 module? And it's telling me you can import it that from Beautiful Soup. Okay. Alternatively, you can import it using the following command: import BS4 and then use it as bs4.beautifulsoup. Before importing BS4, you have to make sure that the package is installed in your system. You can install it via pip by running pip install BS4. Well, let's switch back over and go to the terminal and see if we can make that happen. So if I'm here, can I actually just type in pip install BS4? Hey, okay, well, I mean, did that work? I don't know. Let's see what happened. Let's go back to run and hit run without debugging. There you go, right? So hey, this didn't actually happen to me last time. So the last time I did this, and it's been a couple months, ChatGPT wrote the script a little bit differently. Just another thing to consider about ChatGPT, right? It's not always going to write things exactly the same way, nor does it remember what it wrote from a previous chat or even a chat that you had just done with it maybe earlier in the day. It's not going to remember those things. But what you have to understand is that if you just go back and you give it some more specificity and you be a little bit more direct about what you want, it can really provide you with a bunch of different alternatives to solve the problem. And in this case, I didn't have the BS4 module installed, so I went back to ChatGPT and I asked it, how can I install the module? It gave me the answer. I popped back over to VS Code, I typed in pip install BS4, and it went out and installed it for me. And as you can see, after installing the module, I went back to run and I hit run without debugging, and looking at the terminal here, the script ran successfully. If I look down in here, I actually have the output that I was looking for. So if you note, here is a JSON representation of everything that was in this HTML, but it's spelled out exactly like I want it. So what I'm going to do is go in here and grab this array, copy it, create a new file yet again. This time we're going to do JSON, but let's see if it can detect it. Just paste it in. Okay, it doesn't see it as JSON, so I'm going to come down here to the corner like we did last time, go to plain text, hit JSON, and there it formatted it. So now I can hit right click, format document, and what a beautiful thing. We now have JSON. So, how can we use this? Well, we need to go back to our flow, and we need to use that old friend that we used earlier called parse JSON and see what we can do with that. Now, what I like to do is kind of look through this first, right? Like, there's some problems in here. Like, look right here, Hong Kong. We have like an escape code and then this massive thing here. This could cause some issues. So maybe what we need to do is clean that up a little bit. One other great thing about VS Code is if you have a consistent problem like we do here, if you highlight something, it will show you all of the instances where that shows up. And notice over here on the right-hand side of the on the scroll bar, you see all these little gray dots. That's actually all the instances in which this /in and this many spaces shows up. So I can click through here and see all the different occurrences of where that is. And even better than that, what I can do is I can replace all these things at once. So I know that this escape code, it probably just needs to be a single space. So what I'm going to do is highlight what I want to change, right click and hit change all occurrences. Control F2 is the shortcut key if you want to do it that way. Once I click that, I can simply hit backspace and then boom, it sets it the way that I want it. Really, really powerful stuff. So I'm going to just do a quick check through here, make sure everything looks decent because I'm about to take all this information and put it back over into our flow. And it all looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do, Control A, Control C, and then what I'd like to do from here is pop back over to our browser and look at our flow again. So here we are, we're back at our flow, and what I'm going to do is close out the developer tools, and I'm going to start working with what we have now. So I have an array in my clipboard, and it's the result of the ChatGPT Python script that we created. So what I'm going to do is insert a new step, and I'm going to just do a compose. Now I could do an array variable here, that would work fine too, but I'm just going to do a compose, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it tzArray, just so we know, because it's starting to get confusing, right? You should really be renaming your actions as you go along, but I have a bad habit of not doing that when I'm in a hurry. And I'm going to go ahead and paste in the output of our GPT created Python script. And so now you can see we have this big JSON array in here. And what I'm going to do is just kind of collapse that and create another action. I'm going to use our old friend parse JSON. And the content of that is going to be the output of the tzArray, right? Because I want to look to this. I'm looking to get values out of there. So I'm going to say parse that. The schema I'm going to generate from a sample, which is going to be exactly what I just pasted into the compose, or into the tz compose action. I'm going to hit done, and you can see in here it read the schema tz string, exactly the same schema that we had for our well, essentially exactly the same schema that we had for our payload and the trigger, with the exception that it's called tz instead of time. But anyway, doesn't matter. So now that we've parsed that, why don't we rename that as well? Parse tzArray. Okay, so what do we need to do, right? What was the problem we were originally trying to solve? The problem we were trying to solve is we need to be able to filter that array so that we can create a custom value here in the create event action. So there's a really handy action in Power Automate called filter array. So I'm going to type that in, pick that. The array that I want to filter is actually from the parse. When you parse a piece of JSON in a parse JSON action, that action is aware of the schema, and subsequently when you use that in downstream actions, it becomes much easier to use filter queries against it. So what I'm going to do is say I want the body of the parse tzArray, and the value I want to choose, I want to say, right, remember up here in compose 2, this is where we did our slice. This produced +11, right? So what I want to do is I want to filter out the tzArray that ChatGPT made for us with its Python script, and I want to only get back the values that have plus 11 in them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say, I want to do a contains, right? Because we have plus 11, and we know that that is a substring of our tzArray values that we got back from the script from ChatGPT. So what I'm going to do here is when I choose a value for filtering the array, again, we're filtering parse tzArray. I'm going to say, I want to parse tzArray where tzArray is not equal to, but contains, and then the outputs from compose2, which of course is our slice. So this is our plus 11 right here, right? So one of the things you have to be really careful about when you're doing this is to make sure that, number one, you're comparing two of the same data types. So if you're trying to do a filter array and you're comparing a string to a number, for example, that might not work. And the other thing that you want to look at is to make sure that the two values that you're comparing are the same. And sometimes what you'll see with scenarios like this is that you have some like trailing spaces or something that can screw you up. So one thing that I like to do to kind of prevent problems like that from happening is to come in here and do one more piece of string manipulation against our outputs. So if I go, I know this is the compose2 outputs. I'm going to go back up here to my slice, and I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to wrap it in string, the string function, which turns a number or any other value that it can into a string. And secondly, I'm going to wrap it in trim. And trim is going to take off any leading or trailing spaces or carriage returns or anything like that that could screw up the comparison. So I'm going to do that and hit update, which that gives us a new expression up here for compose2, a little bit more complicated, not too crazy. And of course, our filter array is still using the same outputs from compose2 to compare against the tzArray value. So why don't we go ahead and run that, and let's see what happens. Okay, it says it ran successfully. All right, and compose3 has Bougainville Island, right? And apologies to the inhabitants of this island, because I'm sure I am absolutely butchering that name. Anyway, so we got the first value back. Again, I don't care what plus 11 it is, whether it's that or Magadan or whatever the other ones were. So as long as it's plus 11, I'm happy. Let's go ahead and edit the flow. Let's come down here, get rid of our terminate action. And then lastly, let's go ahead and come to our time zone value for create event 4. And let's get rid of what's in there. And let's go to inner custom value. And I'm going to put the outputs from compose3 because, again, this produced the right result. We just saw it. It gave us that plus 11 value that we were looking for. And we know that it matches the time zone values that are available. Shouldn't be any errors because we pulled directly from the list that's there in the time zone parameter for create event v4. So we should be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then what I'd like to do, I think, is let's go back over to Postman and see if we can create a calendar event for, I don't know, maybe a week from now. What is today? Today's the 19th, maybe the 26th, right? Let's see if we can create a calendar event for the 26th. All right, so we're back over here at Postman, and one thing I wanted to point out is that, when I saved the flow last time, you probably didn't catch it, and it may have gotten edited out of the video, but one thing that you have to do if you're passing JSON as a payload into a Power Automate cloud flow where your trigger is expecting a JSON payload, you need to come over here to headers. You need to make sure you have a content type header that defines the content that you're passing in as JSON. So I set a key of content-type and a value of application/JSON. And what that does is, at least in Postman, is it kind of changes the way that your body, your raw body string looks. It actually reads it as JSON at that point. So what I'm going to do is I've put in a new value here, 2023-126 at 8:30 plus 11 UTC. So I'm going to go ahead and send that. Of course, I don't know what time that is in Eastern time, but we're about to find out. So I'm going to hit send. And we've got a 202 accepted. So that means that the flow should have run. Let's switch back to the flow. Take a look at that. And if I go back here and go back to my flow, we do have a successful run. And it looks a little strange. Up here we have the start time of the 26th and end time of the 25th, which of course would be going back in time. That doesn't really make sense. But if we look down in the outputs, we can see that it actually started at the 25th and 21:30 and ended at 2200. So we have that 30-minute window we were looking for, and there might need to be some slight modifications there. So at the end of the day, what I've been trying to get across to you here is that what I was able to do is use ChatGPT to write a Python script that I didn't know how to write myself and create value out of that, right? These other things I can troubleshoot. I'm familiar with Power Automate, I'm familiar with Cloud Flows, I know about Exchange and Outlook. So those things are easy, but stripping all of that information out of the HTML, that was something I'd never done before. And it was something I didn't really know how to handle in Flow in an easy way. I would have been doing all kinds of crazy expressions to try to get that information out, and I didn't have to do that in this instance because I had ChatGPT available. So I know that was a lot of information, but I hope you got something valuable out of it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this. I realize that we're probably going to be touching on some fairly complicated topics, but I suspect a lot of you out there watching are in the tech industry and are interested in AI and where we're going with this. I really think we're at a very exciting time and to be dealing with these types of platforms. So again, I'm Daniel LeMay. This has been Doing It with AI, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.